All right, class. Welcome to another episode of History with Mr. Rock Dashel. And today, in Lesson 14, we are going to be looking at slavery in Tennessee. Let's go. Okay, class. So let's go ahead and get started with our lesson, and we're going to be still working on summarizing using text evidence and making sure that there's no bias involved. And at times it's going to seem like, what am I doing? I'm just answering questions. But that's because as we work through this, we are working to the point where we can demonstrate, we can summarize parts of a text. And sometimes the question is actually forcing you to summarize it, whether it says it or not. So just keep that in mind if you're thinking about, I thought we were summarizing. We are. We're getting there. It's a process. So today we are going to read information closely to determine the key ideas in the text and then answer questions using text evidence that was gathered while reading. And I'm going to assist you a little bit in reading the article, but then I'll leave it up to you to answer the questions. Here's my recommendation with the questions. It's not always super obvious. You'll have to make some connections as far as what the answers are, maybe even infer a little bit and do some thinking. Otherwise, you're going to be like, that answer wasn't in the text. It's there. Trust me. So, slavery in Tennessee. In 1860, 25% of Tennessee's population was slaves. However, there were more slaves in areas where there were plantations. Hint, that's a question. In the state of Tennessee, approximately 1 in 4 white families owned at least one slave. Cotton and tobacco plantations housed many more slaves, as they were in greater need of men to do the hard labor necessary for growing and harvesting those crops. In Hamilton County, where Chattanooga is located, our town, there were about 200 free blacks and 1,400 slaves. Free blacks had a variety of jobs. Some were common laborers, but others were skilled workers such as blacksmiths. Free blacks also worked as wagon makers, draymen, hack and carriage drivers, farmhands, domestic servants, bricklayers, tinners, janitors, shoemakers, washerwomen, and seamstresses. According to the census data of 1860, 506 slaves lived in the town of Chattanooga. Other slaves lived in the surrounding farms on the outskirts of town. Primary source. Below, in one of the questions, it says in the primary source, and this is the part we're talking about. In the passage, T.H. McCallie recalls how his father owned slaves in Chattanooga. My father owned 5 slaves, 2 men and 3 women, besides 2 little boys, sons of one of the women. So in other words, he had 2 little boys from one of those women. So like one of his slaves had 2 little boys with him. These children were as kindly nursed in the house by the white folks, as kindly cared for, and as much thought of as if they had been white. My father would never buy a slave except with the consent of the party bought, and I do not think he ever sold but one, and that with her consent, as she wished to remain with her husband in Ray County when he moved away. So, that little part there just basically says this guy's father never bought a slave if it wasn't okay with the party, as in the slave he was purchasing. I have a feeling that's not quite normal for the time, but that's this primary source. This guy may have been a real stand-up gent. All right, how could slaves gain their freedom? Sometimes slaves were able to buy their freedom. William T. Lewis was such a man. He lived in Chattanooga for most of his life and worked as a highly skilled blacksmith. This job allowed him to earn enough money to buy his freedom. Important to think about this because this is related to one of our questions again. William T. Lewis, Uncle Bill, was born a slave in Winchester, Tennessee in 1810. He began training as a blacksmith at an early age and developed such a mastery of his craft, he was able, as a young man, to buy his time for $350 a year and save enough money to buy his freedom and that of his wife. The couple moved to Ross's Landing in 1837, 1 year before the completion of the forced removal of the Cherokee people in Oklahoma, and 2 years before the settlement's name was changed to Chattanooga. His home was at the site of the present-day Fountain Square. Lewis earned enough money to purchase the freedom of his 6-year-old son for $400, elderly mother for $150, aunt for $150, and 2 brothers, $1,000 each. He was able to get a slave trader to buy a sister for him for $400. Because of the underclass status of African Americans at the time, he had to hire a white man to legalize the transactions for him. Again, that's part of another question. Okay, so there we have the reading. You get your 4 questions below. I think if you were paying attention, there were at least 4 times where I said, hey, that's a question. So if you need to rewind and find those parts I talked about, I gave you some nice hints there where you could find the answers to the questions below. All right, so as you can see, slavery had some different looks depending on the area of the country that you were in, or even the area of the state that you're in. And just because you were black does not mean that you were treated like a slave, as we saw with that primary source where a slave owner had a couple children with one of his slaves, and those children were treated just like they were his own, not like they were slaves. Now, that was not always the case, but those were probably some exceptions to what really was going on. And I hope that this gave you a little bit of perspective on some of the struggles that went on and some of the realities of life back then. Okay, it's good to see you again. First episode of the week. Take care, and remember, like, share, subscribe, and we'll see you next time.